In those days, we didn't include single releases in albums as we thought that was rather conning the public. One of the biggest errors I ever made.
It was unusual for George Martin to get it wrong. Unlike the Beatles, Martin was an academically trained musician, and that made his contributions to the Beatles very significant, because with his knowledge he was able to materialize the ideas that the group had for their songs. But he was not always absolutely right, and he had several disputes with the Beatles to define the sound of their work, and that is why, in today's video, we will analyze some occasions in which George Martin was wrong about how a Beatles song had to sound. She Loves You is one of the most extraordinary cases where the band's creativity and curiosity surpassed established musical theory. She Loves You was recorded only 5 days after it was written on July 1st, 1963. The single became the best-selling single in British history up to that time, but due to a chord, it was not to end up exactly as we know it. I was sitting in my usual place on a high stool in Studio 2 when John and Paul first ran through the songs. I thought it was great, but was intrigued by the final chord, an odd sort of major sixth, with George doing the sixth and John and Paul the third and fifths, like a Glenn Miller arrangement. They were saying, "It's a great chord, nobody's ever heard it before." Of course I knew that wasn't quite true, said George Martin. Paul said, "We rehearsed the end bit of She Loves You and took it to George, and he just laughed and said, 'Well, you can't do the end, that sixth, it's too like the Andrews Sisters.' We just said, 'All right, we'll try it without.' And we tried it, and it wasn't as good." Then he conceded, "You're right, I guess." We loved that bit, and we rehearsed it a lot. The Beatles were just starting their career and had the balls to question George Martin's hierarchy. Paul said that wasn't the only time they rejected George Martin's guidance about arrangements. He would often give us parameters like, "You mustn't double a third," or "It's corny to end with a sixth, and a seventh is even cornier." We'd say, "We like it, man, it's bluesy." It was good that we could override a lot of his so-called professional decisions with our innocence. So we never listened to any rules. She Loves You ends in an iconic way thanks to that chord, and it's part of his trademark, being one of the few times George Martin was wrong about the way a song should go. Strawberry Fields Forever, Penny Lane, the Beatles' most ambitious single to that point, was a sentimental journey where surrealism and memories of John and Paul's childhood were the main theme of both songs. In Strawberry Fields, for example, 2 versions were to Lennon's total liking, but had different tempos. One of Martin's most innovative contributions was to merge the 2 tracks, speeding up the slow part and slowing down the fast part. The Beatles and their producer were proud of this work, but due to pressure from the record company, these 2 tracks were released as singles, and due to a band policy of not including singles on their LPs, both songs were left off the Sgt. Pepper's album, a decision that George Martin called the worst of his career.
The reason that Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane didn't appear on the album was that Brian Epstein, their manager, was worried and said to me, "The boys need a lift, they need a great single, what have you got?" Well, I said, "We've got 2 wonderful songs, let's issue them both." In those days, we didn't include single releases in albums as we thought that was rather conning the public. One of the biggest errors I ever made.
How do you do what you do to me?
Honestly, George Martin was not the biggest fan of the Beatles' early work, and with not much faith in the band's songwriting, suggested recording Mitch Murray's How Do You Do It as the A-side to their first single. Martin felt the song had enormous hit potential. The group objected to recording it, although they later made a version with some changes. Paul said that even if the song had hit potential, they didn't want to go out with that kind of reputation. The song was then given by Martin to Jerry and the Pacemakers, who recorded their version with a very similar arrangement to what the Beatles had recorded, and eventually they ended up getting the number 1. And while Martin wasn't wrong about the song's potential, he was wrong about releasing a song not written by the band as a Beatles single. The Beatles had a contract with United Artists to record 3 movies, 2 of which had already been made, A Hard Day's Night and Help, but the band had no interest in returning to the movies, at least not in that format. And a cartoon movie was the most comfortable way for the Beatles to get rid of this commitment. In the clauses, they specified that they would not dub their characters and that they would provide some filler songs. The production company agreed a bit dissatisfied, and of the 6 songs they contributed to the soundtrack 2 had already been previously released. However, all of side 2 was empty, and the decision was made to include an orchestral part by George Martin. That this was part of an official Beatles discography affected the reputation of the album, which perhaps could have been just an EP.
It's hard to describe a relationship. They either say Martin did everything, or the Beatles did everything. It was neither one. George had done little of, no rock and roll when we met him, and we'd never been in a studio, so we did a lot of learning together. He had a very great musical knowledge and background, so he could translate for us and suggest a lot of things, which he did, and he'd come up with amazing technical things, like slowing down the piano and playing it slow and putting it on, and things like that, where we'd be saying, well, can we only go ooh and ee, and he'd say, well, look, chaps, I thought of this afternoon. Last night I was talking to whoever he was talking, and I came up with this, and we'd say, oh, great, I'll put it on here,
On the same day that the Beatles left their studios to take the famous cover of their Abbey Road album on August 8, 1969, the band worked in the studio on I Want You. They had already recorded a few tracks weeks earlier, but it was time to get back to it. As Jeff Emmerich recalls, Lennon was so enamored of the white noise that George Harrison had overdubbed from his Moog synthesizer that he actually had Ringo supplement it by spinning the wind machine secreted in the Studio 2 percussion cupboard. As we sat in the control room mixing the track, he started becoming almost obsessed with the sound. Louder! Louder! He kept imploring me. I want the track to build and build and build, he explained, and then I want the white noise to completely take over and blot out the music altogether. And although the song was cut abruptly, George Martin was not very happy with the way the song was ending, especially with the white noise, and suggested to remove it without success.
We grew together, and so it's like saying, it's hard to say who did what,
Yeah.
I mean, he taught us a lot, and I'm sure we taught him a lot by our sort of primitive musical ability, which is all I have still. I still have to have something to translate what I'm trying to say all the time. And so it was a mutual benefit, society, whatever they call it.
The collaboration between the Beatles and Martin was spectacular, and many times they took creative risks that went against everything. Their willingness to innovate contributed significantly to their legacy. Write us below what other examples you remember, and what other songs you would like to see on the channel. We would be very grateful if you would like the video and subscribe so you don't miss our videos. Thanks for watching. This is Music Box.